Hey guys, this is Miss Young and we're going to be taking notes over sectionalism. Take a look at that map there and you might be able to kind of tell just exactly what sectionalism might be about. This is what leads us up to the divisions that kind of create the Civil War as we know it. So get your pencils ready, let's get started. So in order to understand sectionalism, let's try to figure out the definition. Obviously, we see the word section within that word, and we're going to figure out what these different sections are. Now, sectionalism has an important meaning, and it means when you put the interest of your section or your region over the interests of the entire country, and that's what these different sections were doing at this time. This leads us up to the friction between these different parts of the country, which takes us to the Civil War. So we got to know, where are we dividing at? Where is the division taking place? So let's get some lines on here. So on your map, on your notes, go ahead and draw that red line. It's going to trace around the top edge of Texas, follow along Arkansas, across Tennessee, and over Virginia. That kind of divides the southern section from this huge northern portion. But we have one more line. So go ahead and draw that blue line, and this is where you divide the northern section from the western section. So in the northern region, I want you to go ahead and draw exactly what you see here. I don't need you to be Picasso. I just need you to do the best that you can so that you can determine just exactly who is here, what's going on here, because we need to be able to identify the economic factors, geographic factors, and social factors of each region. So in the north, the economic principle here is factories. Same thing, you could call it manufacturing, you can call it industrialization. It's all mainly the same thing. The reason this happens is because the soil is so poor here, and it has a cold climate, that it was not ideal for farming. Yeah, they farmed a little bit. Think about early on in September when we talked about colonies. That's because that was the only thing to do. There were no really cool inventions like we have at this point. But farming wasn't how they made money. In the north, once you started having these inventions like the cotton gin, and you had, which, let's think about that, that actually affected the south, which ended up affecting the north. We'll talk about that later. In the north, these other inventions like the steam engine really started to allow factories to pop up. Now you got to realize that the Industrial Revolution had already occurred in Britain, and it came over to America a little bit later. So naturally, when the industrialization or Industrial Revolution found itself in America, it suited itself in the north because the soil's not any good. Now the people that are here, we have immigrants. So what we're drawing for our immigrants is we have a four-leaf clover for the Irish. You know, let me get a color here. So right here is where I have my little characteristics for social, because what I wanted to do was show the Irish, we have the Chinese, and then we have the Germans. Those are the three groups that we kind of really discussed on our Industrial Revolution notes that we took last bundle. So make sure you have the pictures drawn here, have labeled the northern section, and wrote the notes out to the right side of your map. Now we need to identify the southern region. So in the south, you're going to draw the handcuffs, you'll draw little plots of cotton, and then you're going to write what you see on the far right. So the economic factor in the south is cotton plantations, along with slavery. They go together. You don't have plantations without slaves. And they call this King Cotton because it kind of ruled the area, it ruled the south. It determined a lot of things, not just economics. It probably determined a lot of politics. As you can imagine, they didn't want to outlaw slavery because it was it was necessary for them to be able to be successful with their plantations. If you remove the slaves, guess who can't pluck cotton? The plantations are going to crash. Now, why did plantations find themselves in the south? That's because there was such good soil. The weather was really good for longer growing seasons. And the social aspect here is slave labor. The slaves are the one doing the work. Now, before we really get into the nitty-gritty of the Civil War, let's just kind of be realistic here. If you were to take the slaves out of the South and they were no longer able to process the cotton off the farms or harvest the cotton off of the farms, where would the North get all their cotton that they used in the factories to make textiles? Remember, textiles is a fancy word for clothes or cloth. You make curtains with it, you make sheets, whatever. So if you think about that, if you take away the slaves in the South, everybody's economy is going to crash, because the South's economy relied on slavery to get the cotton, and the North relied on the South to give them cotton. And if you can't pick the cotton, you can't send the North the cotton. So you got to kind of keep that in mind. I know that slavery is, at this point in history, the South considers it necessary, and the North does too. They just aren't willing to admit it. All right, the final section is the West. So in the West, they call it the breadbasket. In this region, they also got to vote on slavery, but they were very confused about whether they were going to be slave state or free state. You also have in the California region, we have, here's California, we have the gold. Okay, so with all that gold comes the gold rush, and people were coming over here trying to get rich quick. Really had a rush of population. They called it the breadbasket as well because you had these a huge amount of wheat fields. So go ahead and write and draw what you see there, and we'll move on when you're done. All right, so now that we know the different sections of sectionalism, let's talk about why do we have these sections? Why are we dividing? Why can't we stay united as a country? Tariffs is our first major topic over why we are dividing. We've actually talked about this already, but we're going to get into it again because it is considered one of the things that lead us up to being divided, leading up to the Civil War. So in the North, we have this love for high tariffs. The reason they love high tariffs in the North is because it protects their companies from foreign competition. If you have on the shelf American-made products as the cheaper product, cheaper than, let's say, Great Britain, then most people are naturally going to buy the cheaper product. And it's going to protect our companies, American companies, from going under and being destroyed by the competition of these foreign companies. The South, however, hates high tariffs. Yeah, go ahead and draw the heart, draw the frowny face. Sometimes drawing things helps it stick better. So the South hates high tariffs because they feared that England or Europe altogether would not buy their cotton. They thought that if we jack up their prices, they're going to be mad at us, and then they're not going to buy our cotton. So we were afraid it was going to ruin our business relationship with other countries. Now the West is one that we haven't discussed yet. The West, they actually like high tariffs because remember, a tariff is an added tax on foreign goods. That extra tariff helped to pay for roads and canals that would connect the West to the Northeast. So you have all these roads, okay, especially from here to here. You have, I know we have a railroad going through here. You have all, and then they just start spawning off. And all of a sudden, people can get to the West a lot easier with the canals and specifically railroads start to just kind of spiderweb across the United States. And the West thought this was fantastic. It was a way to get goods and services and people from this part of the country to the West. So slavery is our next big topic of why we have started to see these divisions in the country. In the North, they hate slavery. They have the Abolition Society. Remember, abolition is the movement to get rid of slavery. They have the Underground Railroads, and remember, these are not real railroads that run underground. Maybe there were tunnels, but it's mostly trails that people like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass used to help slaves in the South to escape to the North, and specifically more so to Canada, because at this point in history, Canada is controlled by Britain, and Britain has already outlawed slavery, so they could get there and guaranteed to be free. In the North, slave trade has been abolished. There's also a high population of free blacks, but they only have some rights. And the land in the North doesn't require slave labor. Remember, we have the manufacturing systems that are just dominating the northern region, and it does not require slaves to do work. Maybe once they become free, they go get jobs, but they're not considered slaves. They get to choose to go to work and make money. Slaves do not. They are considered property. Which takes us to the South. In the South, they love slavery. And it's not about dominating a race right now. Right now, it's about, I need this tool. Their slaves are property. I need my property to take care of my property, which is I need my slaves to harvest my cotton. Their whole idea is that states have rights. We need these to maintain our economy. Slaves help maintain the economy. Think all the way back to the Andrew Jackson bundle. When we had the nullification crisis, John C. Calhoun goes down to South Carolina and kind of whispers in their ear and says, "Look, you got rights. If the tariff of abomination goes against your state rights, then just nullify it and move on and do what you got to do." So that's what South Carolina was going to do. Their whole idea is that states have the right to choose for themselves whether slaves should be legal or illegal. The next bullet says that because slaves are property, if they try to escape, they're considered a fugitive. And then there's more issues. And again, the land in the South needs the slave labor to maintain the crops. And last but not least, we have the West. The West is a little confused. They're confused about slavery. They fight about slavery and about keeping a balance of free state to slave states. So now let's cover some of our compromises. We've already talked about this one, but we kind of need a refresher. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was originally meant to keep slavery from spreading. Their whole thought was, let's do it like this. Everything above this 36° 30 line, everything above it is going to be considered free. Everything below it is going to be slave. Except for Missouri at this point has been added as a slave state, but was above the line. Whoopsie, right? So okay, sorry, we got to keep a balance because now we have more slave states to free states. And when you think about it, and you have Congress, and if Congress is lopsided where they are more slavery, pro-slavery than they are against slavery, then all of a sudden you could have this huge imbalance of congressmen. And so they're like, okay, we need to add a free state. So then they're like, all right, let's add Maine as a free state. And this keeps the balance between the free states and slave states. Now, the whole guy who came up with this is Henry Clay. He's called the Great Compromiser. I'll show you all these words in just a minute. Give me a second. So, yeah, he's this dude. He just comes up with this fantastic compromise that allows us to keep the balance of slave states to free states, but still has everything above the line is free and below the line is slave. All right, now you can see everything. All right, our next compromise is the Compromise of 1850. Again, this is still before the Civil War, because we are still dividing. This is kind of some of the things that are causing us to have friction between these different sections. So after the U.S.-Mexican War, all right, we gained the Mexican Cession. Boom, there it is. And we're like, oh my gosh, is this going to be free or is it going to be slave? Are we going to have free? Is it going to be free to the blacks, or are we going to make them slaves here? So this begins to divide our country. So what happens is California enters as a free state. This makes the North really happy. See, we got a happy face in the North. But the rest of the Southwest is open to slavery, which makes the South happy. So just because California enters as free, everything else in the orange, that's the Utah territory and that's the New Mexico territory, is getting to be open to slavery. The next thing under the Compromise of 1850 is the government abolishes the slave trade. Yay, makes the North happy. However, slave owners get to keep their current slaves. Makes the South happy. And the final part of the Compromise of 1850 is the Fugitive Slave Law. The Fugitive Slave Law requires that it requires the return of runaway slaves back to their master. Okay, so if like this is kind of where you get oh gosh, what's the word? I can't think of it. Where they go and they go up to the north. People from the south go to the north and they hunt down black people, and they're like, oh, well, you're black, you must have been a slave and escaped. And so you have this manhunt for any guy any black man or woman in the north, whether they're free or not, to be able to go, you know what, I bet your master's looking for you, come on. And they get arrested and they get taken back to the south. Now the whole idea was to allow the slaves, or excuse me, allow the South to keep their slaves, like it said in part 2, but it kind of backfired, and it allowed for just this overall manhunt. Now remember, there's free blacks in the northern states who were once slaves, but when the North outlawed slavery, they were like, okay, you're free, go, you know, they could go get jobs and make money. But once you implemented the Fugitive Slave Law, it's like open season, and you could have somebody go and hunt you down and bring you back to the South where you didn't really have a master. But they're like, oh, too bad, you know, you're here now and slavery's legal here, so hop on in on the cotton field and get going. So it's very controversial. You can imagine how this continued to drive a wedge between the northern states to the southern states. All right, our final compromise or act, whatever you want to call it. This is classic. You're gonna just seem so typical of a congressman anymore. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is proposed by a congressman named Stephen Douglas because he wants to be able to get the southern support for a railroad that runs through the north. Okay, so he's going to try to do something to help to make the South happy, so that the southern congressmen will vote for this railroad, that the railroad will go through the north. Okay, long story short, it's all about the votes, right? So he is going to try to convince Congress to allow a railroad to be put through the north. Now this railroad conveniently goes through his land, which means big bucks for Stephen Douglas. Okay, now this is Stephen Douglas. This act eventually, it's actually going to overturn the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This is not good news for the North, okay? Where it basically said everything above the line is free, below the line is slave. Oops, Missouri's in as a slave state above the line. Let's add Maine, now we're balanced. What Douglas proposes is that we allow popular sovereignty. Now remember, popular sovereignty was one of our 7 principles of the Constitution. Popular meaning like, oh my gosh, I'm so popular. Okay, this means people. Okay, it has to do with people. And then to reign means to rule over. So the people rule. So when the people rule, what that means is they are going to be the ones that vote on whether the territory will be free or slave in the Kansas-Nebraska area. So we're like, all right, fine, let's do this. The northern people are like, you know what? We're going to send people in to this territory, because we're voting, we're going to send in people to this area and we're going to bulk up the vote. Yeah, the South does the exact same thing. Nowadays, you can't do that. Nowadays, when it's time to vote, I have a specific place I have to go in order to vote. It's either at this specific spot or I have to go to the courthouse. I can't go to any state and just vote. I have to vote in my region where my address is established. That's not how it was yet. The northern states were flooding Kansas, Nebraska area with their people. The South is flooding this area with their people, trying to bulk up the vote because they want to make sure that they win and that Kansas, Nebraska area gets to be slave in the eyes of the South. And the North is like, no, we want it to be free. So huge disagreements take place at the voting booths, flares up, causing bloodshed, and this actually becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. Not our finest moment, but there you have it. So make sure you write everything you see, wait for instruction, and move on when you're done.